Yo, this is a new episode of The Lies That Bind Us.
Coming to you from my closet and Ash's
Shed,
shed.
shed.
Shed. Yeah.
This is a shed. I'm not gonna move my camera around for everyone to see it, but almost everyone thinks that when I say I have an office shed, that it's like a sad, dirty old shack instead of a four-season, like 200 square feet
It's
mind
yeah.
palace.
You almost have your own apartment in there.
Yeah, if I could just get one of those, if I had a plumbing situation, that would help. I guess I could put a couple buckets in here and
There you go.
live here when the times get difficult, which they're coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Trump. And
Mm-hmm. But yeah, my entire setup is like this curtain that's behind me. Like behind that is storage stuff, and then like I have clothes on the side of me.
I, I, it's just too easy to make jokes about coming out of the closet, so
Yeah.
I'm just not even gonna go there.
So many.
The
Yep.
viewers know. You can populate them yourselves. Leave some of your favorite coming out of the closet jokes in the comments.
There you go.
There we go.
All
What are
right.
we talking about today? It's sparked by an argument on the interwebs.
Yeah. It's not the first time I've had this argument, nor will it be the last. But the argument for objective morality, and I think we'll probably talk about objective reality, um, in a more general sense. But there's like this long history of using objective morality as like this apologetics type thing, especially amongst Christianity, that says, well, there needs to be something that defines objective morality, or
or it's or it's raping pets and
yeah, it's always like the
skinning
worst thing that
babies
you
for
can.
food just 24/7.
Yeah, yeah, and so like the argument is, if there is objective morality, then there has to be something that makes it objective. Thus, there has to be a God that defines morality. Um, Which, even if that was true, that wouldn't be a good case for Christianity, because you would have to then prove that it's the Christian God that establishes morality, and that might be difficult to do with the amount of times that he kills babies in Scripture.
Yeah,
Just
and it ends up being morality turtles all the way down.
yeah, it really
Like
does.
what's the I mean, take the classic example, um, or a classic example of the complications of morality when being based in God's divine will. It's the whole Abraham and Isaac story. Um, you're gonna tie up your kid and murder him because God said so, and then last second God says, haha, just kidding. Like there's no what's the universal principle there? Because these
Mhm,
people who are into objectivity want there to be static universal principles. They don't really
mhm.
want it to be based upon prophetic revelation.
Yeah,
So it gets weird when you bring God into it because God communicates. And that story there's lots of stories like that from the Bible where God tells people to do things that don't make sense according to some sort of universal principle.
yeah. Or the times that it says that God repents, because that actually shows up every once in a while, especially in like the story of Jonah. It literally says that God doesn't destroy Nineveh because God repented, uh, which is means that God is doing some subjective stuff there and changing God's mind and things like that. But ultimately, like to me, like let's say there is objective morality, right? And let's say that there is a God that defines objective morality. And we might fall into what's called divine command theory, which is this idea that God just creates what is morality out of whatever God thinks is right and commands it, and that is what is moral.
Yep.
The issue is, you wanted to add to that?
No, it's just like who gets the secret decoder ring is always the
Yeah,
question.
yeah, that is actually the thing. Like, like, even if you hold that idea and you say, "Oh, and the Bible tells us everything we need to know about morality," that it still isn't true because that is still based off subjective human interpretation of scripture or of like their understanding of God's command. Like that is a subjective interpretation to each individual person. So even if there was objective morality that was being established by a God of the universe, there wouldn't be any access to it because it would still be a human understanding of that. And so
Hmm.
like it's almost pointless to then discuss it because it's
Yeah,
something
like
humans couldn't have access to anyways.
yeah, if objective reality is a thing, um, like even if we fully grant that, we're not objective, so we're kind of screwed.
Mhm,
Um, and then so this is where it kind of comes down to it. It's like if you look at the way claims to objective morality and objective reality have been used, it's almost always a power move,
mhm.
and it gets into this thing like you can't start talking about objective reality you know, well, you start talking about objective morality, it leads you into objective reality. Like, how do we know what we know?
Yeah, of course.
Epistemology, right? And then it always gets into this thing where um, you have to really have some basis in science. This is where you get the modernist weirdness that is evangelical Christians who claim to have some sort of like supernatural connection to the divine, having an approach to reading scripture and approaching reality that's based on science. And
Mhm,
then like but then like there's these weird areas where like except for some areas of science that we don't like. So it's
pretty
very
much.
selective. It's like the picking and choosing approach to scripture then gets applied to the picking and choosing approach to science.
Mhm,
And then you get uh, moral arguments from things like the created order, which is where it gets really um, shitty for folks like us. I'm going to pull up the picture and I'll tie it in. I'll do my best. So, you know, so the UK Supreme Court recently did a similar thing that the United States did by act of Donald Trump's ex cathedra, apparently.
mhm.
Trans people don't have any legal right to against discrimination. And so J.K. Rowling, um, ugh, it's like
This is
real
like the worst photo also, like
real life
so
Voldemort in
yeah.
drag. Uh,
Somebody posted a photo of this photo with, like, Andrew Tate do doing the exact same pose, and it's like, yeah, that's actually the same energy right there.
more like Andrew Taint. But anyways, she she says, I love it when a plan comes together. And like this is just a villain picture. Let's just be honest. Um,
Oh, absolutely.
her whole thing is saying we need to protect women and children from trans women in particular, and that trans women shouldn't have any kinds of recognition whatsoever. Um, and so, okay, let's assume that that's true, which isn't like that we're somehow not real women. Um, you end up with this kind of thing happening where this claim to objective reality is a power move, and it's often done with cruelty. There's this
Mhm,
moral indignation and disgust response tied into these things, and I'm gonna like uh, get a little historical here. When we talk about white supremacy, there was a scientific basis
mhm,
uh, for white supremacy that white people came up with and you know passed around for years, and some people still do. The book The Bell Curve didn't come out that long ago, really. So you
mhm.
have this scientific racism, which isn't scientific, but where
It's
that
something
idea
that is real though, like, it has
it
been shown to exist that it's a thing.
yeah, people talk about it, they build policy off of it, they build the morality off of it, and then they get to be cruel and vindictive about it. It becomes a
Mhm.
use of power. And so to me, it becomes weird when you have arguments with people online, and they want to talk about the minutia of objective reality as though they have some sort of unique special claim to it that you or I don't have.
Mhm.
But then they don't want to talk about the implications or why, the emotional reasons why they're making that move. And to me, psychologically, sociologically, ethically, it's important to ask what's at stake here with making this truth claim. And as someone who I guess would be a little bit more postmodern, I don't want to talk about claims to objective reality without talking about the implications of them. Because human beings are so subjective, it's important to know what someone's motive is.
Yeah.
Because there's never been science done ever that hasn't been at least influenced by that. That's why science is an ongoing project.
Mhm. It, and as much as Christianity hit, like when I was in Bible college, we would have entire classes on like how to deal with postmodernism because it is a disconnect from reality.
I have
Um,
a Christian
their
thought
words, yeah,
concentration for my Master's of Divinity,
yeah.
which is ironic, but I had to take all the classes on apologetics
Hmm.
and proving the Christian worldview
Yeah. That,
worthless.
yeah.
Sorry.
There's so much that can be said about Christian worldviews, and the concept of a Christian worldview was intentionally created to say that Black people didn't have a Christian worldview. Just an FYI, like to to anybody who's still like trying to use that, like it was literally created to justify why white Christians and Black Christians tend to vote different. Like
Yeah,
simple truth right there.
it's it's
But that
it's it's a colonial project. The whole
yeah, it is.
fabrication of the idea of a Christian worldview as some sort of static thing, which always ends up somehow being anchored and centered in white expressions of Christianity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But this idea, uh, I think the most interesting thing is the like where we are at is this like world where um people think that they're still modern and are against postmodernism but have no actual connection to even perceived objective truth. So like the stuff that C.S. Lewis was writing about in like the Abolition of Man, where he's talking about subjectivity and things like that, like we were taught that that was the like liberal, like progressive left that was going to be the ones that are abolishing humanity in essence.
Hmm.
However, like C.S. Lewis's critique actually fit far right conservatism a lot more closely than um progressive left, because it is so based on the ignoring of evidence to the point where it's all just vibes. Like when you can just cast off evidence, cast off people's experience, cast off your own like view of what is going on in the world around you, um it it's no longer objective. Like conservatism is highly um in a world of um subjectivity that is based on nothing, essentially.
Hmm. There's often an all or nothing aspect to this too, where somehow um, it's like this fear of slippery slopes, and it's a very evangelical Protestant way of thinking. And I'm going to try to see if I can explain this well. But like, there's this idea that somehow, if we don't acknowledge that in every situation there is an objective truth to be laid hold upon, then somehow, then we don't have access to any objective truth.
Mhm.
So if you have to be certain, there has to be a level of certainty every time, or you can't ever have certainty. And therefore, if you make some sort of argument that gender and sex are a strict binary, if you challenge that, then people will say,
Mhm.
what? Um, Next thing you're going to say is that you can just jump really hard and you can defy the laws of gravity. And really, what it is when people make that kind of, and it's a ridiculous framing of the argument, but we've all been engaged with people who have this way of thinking, and it
Mhm.
shows they're not committed to objective reality. They're committed to an authoritarian view of things that gives certainty. And I think people confuse those two in their own minds. They don't realize there's a difference. And so that's why we end up with our current regime, which is not really committed to truth. But many of the people who are most likely to lay claim to something like objective reality are more likely to have voted for Trump, who is
Mhm.
incredibly deceitful, like even compared to other presidents who have also been incredibly deceitful. I'm not some big fan of Democrats. It's
No,
just Trump is uniquely shitty in certain
yeah,
ways, right?
he like he tends to raise the bar in the level of shittiness, and is normally often celebrated for that.
Hmm.
But the idea that um like you said, people who believe in like objective reality, objective morality, like being drawn to a person like Trump is because he plays into that. Like
Hmm.
uh it's clear that he doesn't believe in any form of morality. It's all just like what he wants to do, but he's able to talk about it in such binary ways. And for people who have an ideology that requires a binary understanding of the world, that it's appealing to them because uh, it's just so much more simplistic to see things as not complex and unnuanced, that
Hmm.
there is a draw there. I mean, I'd be honest, it sounds nice to just be able to turn off your brain and just go along, but the world is complicated. Like, that's
Hmm.
just kind of the fact of the matter. And so whenever we get to concepts that are supposed to be like based in fundamental reality, it uh like it's easy to take that short step, that um shortcut, and just be like, yeah, everything needs to fit in these little defined categories. But that's not how it works. Like, there is nobody who is like completely evil or completely good. Everybody is a combination. And I
Hmm.
there are clearly people who do more evil things than other people. However, they're also part of the system that they were born into, um, where they were given ideologies and views of the world that helped shape them into who they were. So it's both being a perpetrator and a victim of all kinds of factors that are uh, that are acting on different people. And like the modernist understanding of that is like, yeah, all of that is like, it almost gives you a deterministic outcome. But then on top of that, we have unknown factors, because modernism was built on the understanding that all science was predictable. And then we discovered quantum physics, and then we found out things aren't always predictable.
Hmm.
And the more that we the more that we understand the world, we find out things aren't predictable. So we have all of these things like coming in that are influencing us, but also the unpredictability of human nature and our own personal choice, where like even when you get to morality, and whether somebody does something that is inherently good or inherently bad, it's a lot more gray than it ever is just black or white.
Hmm.
That's just reality of the situation. It's The world is complicated.
Yeah, and to me, this is where these sorts of claims to objective reality and objective morality from kind of more of the conservative perspective, like, and I want to acknowledge there are, you get Marxist Leninists who believe in objective reality in a certain kind of way, and objective morality too in a certain kind of way. Um, and that's it has a different vibe, right? So I'm talking about the conservative folks who do this. Um, there's always these other little things that are tied up in it. This idea that they are not emotional.
Mhm.
It's the progressives, liberals that are emotional, and also they're also more likely to claim there's something like common sense, right? And so it sets up this really amazing dynamic where you have people who are making coming to conclusions based on their own emotionality, not
Mhm.
recognizing it, right? And then claiming that what they are asserting is common sense. And meanwhile, they don't understand systems theory. They think all moral choices are individual choices at the most atomist level, and you can't give them any kind of counters to that because
Mhm.
then it's not objective reality. It really comes down to this deep emotional need for certainty. And that is a very toxic thing to have because that's where we end up in this situation where every given day, Donald Trump could say something that contradicts himself,
Mhm.
but it still fits that emotional need for certainty, which is
Yeah.
almost always an appeal to authoritarianism. You have someone who declares what things are. Um, this
Yeah.
is why objective reality is like almost always employed towards authoritarianism because you always have to have somebody with the authority to say this instead of that,
Mhm.
and it happens to be a white guy with xenophobic and homophobic values more often than not.
Yeah, generally, because to become authoritarian, to be that authority figure that people will look to, you generally have to seek out being authoritarian, um, which generally does not lead to people being good people. But you did say something like it's not like it is not just people who are politically conservative. It's also seen in a lot of liberal spaces as well, where this
Mm-hmm.
like um concept of simplicity when it comes to morals, like um the truth of the matter is like what like a well, we'll go with cliches here.
Mm-hmm.
A liberal in a city is going to have different like social political needs as uh, compared to like a rural person like that is a farmer or something like that. Like um and a lot of times like you people like farmers will make decisions that we think are maybe not the best because they have a different understanding of like what they need to survive. Um, Granted, we could like go into all the complicated issues of capitalism within that,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of times like the simplicity of believing that we understand somebody else's reality is something that is incredibly easy for us to fall into as well, because we believe that we see their side of the story so clearly that we make judgments based off that. And then that is done like back on us, where in the reality of a situation is we don't understand what other people are going through. We don't understand the reality that they are living into and what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so this concept of a absolute reality that can be understood is something that we really all fall into. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
it can have very incredibly dire consequences when we don't recognize that.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it's okay if I go out and like like 10 of my neighbors to death. So what's to stop me?
Sure.
If there is an
Yeah,
objective
sure.
morality, this is kind of, I bring that up because people think they're being clever when they do that move, right?
Yeah.
Because they feel like they have an answer to that.
I mean,
Um,
yeah, if
it's
if you
Jesus,
have to
God. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but like if you have to have um Jesus or God or the Bible tell you to not just go murder people, like you're that close to murdering people, but oh no, Jesus said not to. Um you're probably not a good person to begin with. Uh, you might want to deal with that. Um, but also that doesn't explain like all the other things that people are okay with, even though they claim to follow Jesus, like caring for immigrants. Like
Hmm.
Jesus is pretty clear on that too. And but that one's a little bit like uh, yeah, a little more wishy-washy. I think that probably you don't actually want to murder people. Um, because we're all able to find justifications to why our actions are okay when we want to do them.
Hmm. Yeah, and to me, there's a certain amount. I'll put it this way for it's a problematic way to put it, but there's a certain amount of faith in any kind of ethical or moral framework.
Mhm.
And by faith, I mean some sort of belief that orients us that is outside of just pure, um, like what's good for me right now.
Yeah.
There are people that have that as an ethic too, but they're never consistent about it,
Yeah, not normally.
right? No. Um, so, like for me, I believe that it's worth working towards collective liberation, which
Mhm.
is that our Earth, including non-human animals and humans, um, generally having a minimal amount of suffering and level of autonomy
Mhm.
without oppression. And we can get into the complexity of what that would even look like, but I generally believe that's worth going for, not just because um, it's in the Bible or because it's common sense. It's because I honestly believe that it's better for me to live in a world like that.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, uh, not murdering things unnecessarily, it just doesn't make sense. To me, it hurts the soul. Now, all those sorts of claims I just made, it's hard to build any sort of objective framework for any of that. It's
I mean,
subjective, but
yeah, it is subjective.
most people tend to instinctively and intuitively agree with that being relatively the goal.
Mhm.
And so we don't need to know where it comes from. Um, but that
It's
it just
actually
makes
okay if it is subjective.
it
Like,
has to be we have to, like, our lives are subjective. We don't even have a there's not even a there's not even a one we don't even have a single self.
mhm.
When I say I, it's a kind of a mixture of competing intentions. And just because I'm thinking of something in the front of my brain doesn't mean that that's actually all the processes that are happening. We're very
Mhm.
complicated that way. So this idea of objective reality is even further complicated by the fact there's not a unified subjectivity either.
Yeah.
And people don't like that. It's uncomfortable until you completely accept that. Then you're like,
Mhm.
well, I don't know. I'm going to try to do my best. And something tells me loving and being compassionate and working for something better for us all just feels like it makes a lot more sense than the
Yeah,
other
absolutely.
stuff. And that's good
And I
enough.
think I think that there is like humanity is kind of drawn to be in communities as much as like our modern world has tried to tear that out of who we are as people and tried to individualize us and tear
Hmm.
families outside of communities. I think that part of the reason that subjectivity is okay is because I think that morality is supposed to be a collective undertaking,
Hmm.
one that does listen to the experience of other people, especially marginalized people or people that don't have the dominant experience, and understanding those and working together to create a better society. But it is a subjective and ongoing process of continuing to work to be better. The thing is, if there was objective morality, then then there is not necessarily something to work toward, or like that's wrong. It's there is an end goal.
Hmm.
And the fact is the end goal is subjective, but we've already talked about that. with a subjective view of morality, there's not necessarily an end goal. Like,
Hmm.
we could get to a world that is perfectly moral in some person's understanding of absolute morality, and we could still look at that and say, we can do better. And that's
Hmm.
a good thing. Like, progressing to become better, to have a more equitable society. Those are good things to work towards. And it's okay if we never get there, because we can continuously work to improve on us.
Yeah, and this is again why I have a built-in uh, skepticism towards any claims of objectivity, including having a blueprint for what society is supposed to look like.
Hmm.
Which is where here's where I step on the tankies, the Marxist Leninists. This idea of uh, this is what utopia looks like, and this is how we get there. There's always things that we're not factoring in when we make our blueprints, and
Absolutely.
if you're too insistent upon them, then you're going to like oppress a bunch of people along the way. That's why
Hmm.
that's why I lean towards anarchism, which these are big words that are going to be hard to unpack. So we'll have to talk about them another time. But um, which is more process oriented
Hmm.
at the very least. So to me, that idea of we don't know, and we don't know what it's supposed to look like, and if we get to something that feels pretty close, it's okay that we still have more to do. Like I prefer life that way. I
Hmm.
prefer life without that level of certainty because it allows us to interact and respond to things that we don't currently know, which
Yeah,
is most
absolutely.
things, which is most things. It's a
Hmm.
much humbler place to be to say, I don't know. I don't think there's something like objective reality that we can know. It might be there and we can maybe measure some aspects of it in a scientific way, but there's always more that we don't know.
Hmm.
So, practically speaking, we all have to accept some that most of our life is subjective and do the best we can
Yeah.
with it. The end.
And I do want to add, like, it also leaves room for like discovery. Um,
Yeah, which
if
is fun.
we yeah, like if we come, if we finally like make real contact with people from other planets, right? Like,
Mhm.
our understanding of morality is going to have to change. Like, we hardly have the ability to, well, actually, we haven't yet figured out the ability to give all humans autonomy and um, in like actually recognize their humanity. Throw in another like fully sentient species, like, that's going to cause problems with a lot of people. Um,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's when
The
like actual racism, where like race is different type species and not the colonialistic creation to justify to justify oppression. Um, yeah, that's gonna come into play as something.
yeah, I wish science fiction would go there more. It very rarely does.
Mhm.
Usually, science fiction, uh, since you brought up aliens, uh, just doesn't have religion in it for some reason. Which I know
Yeah,
we
that's
know
true.
better than that. Like
Yeah.
a show that came out in the '90s that most people haven't seen because its special effects were shit. Babylon 5. That's the first time, and maybe one of the only times that there's a space station where they have like priests and stuff on it, or The
Mhm.
Expanse, where there's Mormon missionaries trying to build a ship. So it's a very rare thing, and it's usually the not too distant future science fiction. But
Yeah.
then you get to like Star Trek and stuff.
Star Trek,
It's
there's like none.
yeah, unless you're
Or it's
Klingon, it's the
yeah,
backwards, it's the quote unquote backwards people that tend to have like believe in
yeah.
yeah. Um, so that was just an aside. But the other piece of it, like that also points to the more we learn about the the more horizons we cross, the more we realize morality is complicated.
Mhm.
So this is why conservative frameworks tend to be individualistic because it keeps it in the smallest area possible. like the issue of don't steal. Like, well, that's morally absolute. Yeah. Um, once you have systems understanding and realize that capitalism is bullshit, then you realize the definition of theft is really complicated
Mm-hmm.
because
But
all
even
positions are
the
based on past theft.
yeah that
So if I
but
take
even like looking at our own history, like Manifest Destiny was just putting nice words to land theft. So like
and we can't even like it's illegal to talk about that in school. Some schools now.
yeah.
But then those kids are being told not to steal. So if little Timmy takes an apple from uh, Tommy, then he'll get in trouble. And then the idea that one family is rich and the other's poor doesn't factor in. That's kind of usually seen as like liberal. But that's
Mhm.
not brought up to build sympathy only. It's to call into question a system. Like, how can you meaningfully talk about morality around theft where you have a system that's built on exploitation?
Mhm.
It gets really complicated real fast. Like, we could even say the same for murder. Like, obviously, generally speaking, murder is wrong. But if
Unless you're wearing a uniform.
yeah, but then people don't call that murder. They come up with a different category for that
Yeah.
without really explaining why there's a difference. Or on the
Yep.
flip side, most people would recognize that if a child, like someone with a gun, was starting to mow down a bunch of kindergartners, and you could stop him, but you'd have to use lethal force. Most people recognize that that's a complicator to the
Mhm.
issue of whether or not murder is wrong, right?
Yep.
The more you move past a horizon, the more complicated it gets. You start talking about systems theory, you start talking about interplanetary relations, things get extremely complicated. And we have to have a different ethical framework than this is what
Mhm.
we've deduced from the Bible. Um, because even that has never been consistent. So let's stop pretending, right?
Yeah. That's
Even it's not even consistent within itself. Let's be honest about it.
yeah.
Come on.
And this is going to be a lot more philosophical on the concept of God. Let's say that God is absolute, that morality
Mhm.
is based off of the character of God, right?
Mhm.
This is a very classical understanding. Um, that means that God is immutable, which is also a very classic understanding. An immutable God is not all powerful.
Yep.
An immutable God is unable to make decisions. And thus is not all powerful. Like this idea that there is absolute morality because God exists only works if your God is is not all powerful, does not have the ability to make decisions, is does not have the ability to act in ways that are choices. Um, and being able to make choices is inherent to like be having personhood. And
Mhm.
so like ultimately like the more that you go into that understanding of absolute morality based off of an unchanging God, you end up disproving the idea that God is something to actually listen to, because it then God is just this force in the universe that's impersonal, that doesn't matter. Like yeah.
So, I mean, all this comes down to this sense of like, there may be an objective truth, there may be objective morality. The second one, I doubt more. But we can't really get there enough for us to
Yeah.
feel like we
Yeah.
have something like certainty. So instead, let's try to be compassionate and humble about stuff, especially, bringing this back up. When people are talking about their own experiences.
Mhm.
So J.K. Rowling might think she has a very simplistic understanding of biology on her side, and she's using it to be oppressive. When really what should be done is she should be paying attention to the experience and pains of others instead of spreading disinformation. That's what a real feminist would do.
Yeah. And
And
also
that, go
bio
ahead.
biological sex or biologically male is a dog whistle. It was literally created by transphobic people, and it does not follow science.
Yeah. So
So
where's the objectivity in that?
yeah,
People, the only, yeah, I'm just going to be a
it's
broken
a
record here.
it's a made up term to it's a made up term to say something objective, but it is not actually created on actual truth. So
Mhm.
it is saying this is an objective truth, but the word is literally created off of nothing. That it is not
Yeah.
objective. So it is
It's like we're going to create these
yeah,
categories that we can kind of like explain what we care about and then say they're absolute. And then when
and they're
somebody
not.
shows up
They're
saying
not.
like gender's a binary, uh, people act like these constructs like this are common sense since time immemorial. But if you time travel to any society like 2,000 years ago and said gender is a binary, they'd look at you like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
Neither of those categories are the categories they worked within back then.
Mm-hmm.
This is why philosophy, like language games, matter. Truth
Yeah.
is usually a language game for people, and it comes down to power. Um, do I believe in gravity and things like that? Yes, but I'm not going to use those. I'm not going to use the same way of talking about gravity that I'm going to use to talk about human beings that I want to justify oppressing. That's what's
I mean,
happening. This
yeah.
objective morality move.
Like it would be one thing to say, yeah, gravity exists, and stopping there, but then saying gravity exists, thus airplanes and rockets aren't real. Gravity exists. That's an objective truth, right? Um, yeah, like an objective truth is most people are born with genitals. That's not even like you can't say everybody because that's not even true of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But leaving it there is fine. It's whenever you take that to discount the actual existence of something else, like yeah, it is the
Mm-hmm.
same as saying gravity exists, thus airplanes don't.
Yeah, it certainly makes things easier and simpler and more certain
Yeah.
just to stay with that. But once you start accounting for all the variables, a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of humility and kindness goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.